the question of NATO-Ukraine membership has become quite pertinent this week because NATO's 29th member joined this week, Montenegro, and it's very pertinent in that respect to compare the two countries and why Ukraine actually gets a very bad deal out of this. We all know that double standards exist in international relations. We can't teach that to students because it's not really something you want to pass on to the younger generation. But it certainly is true in the Ukrainian case. Was there really, if one has hindsight looking back, a good reason to give up nuclear weapons when Ukraine didn't get any security assurance or guarantees? The US and the UK have not participated in the Minsk process over Russia's aggression against Ukraine, for example. And Ukraine never got NATO membership out of it. But to put this into context, firstly, this is not something that crazy nationalists only want in Ukraine. The first president to ask for NATO membership was Leonid Kuchma, an East Ukrainian, in 2002. There's no coincidence of the date. It came after 9/11 when President George Bush was looking into Putin's soul. I'm surprised he survived that. It was cozying up to Putin after the terrorist attacks in the US. So it was a centrist, an East Ukrainian, who first put this on the map. This question of NATO membership has been supported by 4 out of 5 Ukrainian presidents. The only one that didn't support it was Yanukovych when he was president. When he was prime minister in 2002, 2004, he did support NATO membership because in 2003, Ukraine issued its first national security doctrine where NATO membership was a goal. Then Yanukovych was prime minister and his party of Regents faction supported that law. So Yanukovych only became anti-NATO after the Orange Revolution when he began to cozy up to Putin from about 2005, 2006 onwards. But the consistency in Ukrainian foreign policy from Kravchuk through Kuchma, Yushchenko, and now Petro Poroshenko has been that Ukraine's security lies in integrating with the West, with NATO and the European Union. And if you look at it from a historian's point of view and from the point of view of cultural historians like Myroslav Shkandrij, they will tell you that Ukrainian national identity since the 19th century has been termed and framed in terms of integration into Europe. Because the alternative, which is integration with Russia, does not permit Ukraine to be a sovereign state. We have a situation where the majority of Russians, whether they are in the opposition or they support Putin, do not accept Ukrainians are a separate people, do not accept that Ukraine is a sovereign state, and most Russians believe Ukraine is an artificial and failed state. So how can you integrate into this kind of public opinion, this kind of opinion? Ukraine would not be a real country if it integrated East, and therefore there is no alternative to integrating West. Ukraine offers so many different and more improved areas than Montenegro. It's actually would take a long time to explain these. But Montenegro's military budget is peanuts. Its army is 2,000 strong. Ukraine's total security forces, army, security service, border guards, and such like is close to 500,000. Today, Ukraine spends 5% of its GDP on the military, which is higher than any country in NATO, and obviously it's higher than what Montenegro has. Ukraine has also been extremely active and the most active in NATO operations, in sort of peacekeeping, whether it's in the Balkans, in former Yugoslavia, Afghanistan or elsewhere. Ukraine had the largest non-NATO military contingent in Iraq when Yanukovych was prime minister back in 2003, 2004. The most important, crucial, I would say, disinformation is regarding the question of, how will this lead to stability inside Ukraine? Well, firstly, anything to do with NATO, even if it's not membership, but integration without membership, which is what Ukraine currently has with the European Union, the association agreement is integration without a membership. Then that is positive because it leads to Western influence, Western reforms on Ukraine's military and on Ukraine's non-military law enforcement and security forces. All of that is a positive plus. Just look at the financial assistance from the United States, Canada, and elsewhere in transforming the Soviet-era militia into a European police force. And we now see, for the first time since 1991, where public opinion polls show a rising public trust in the Ukrainian police at a time when the militia had zero public trust. So Ukraine could not do this, could not transform these institutions without Western help. And certainly in the case of the Ukrainian military, we saw the debacles in Ilovaisk in August of 2014, Debaltseve, February 2015. This is a product of still the Soviet-era generals sat in Kiev. So Ukraine needs that transformation of its military. It's taking place quietly, but anything in that direction is good. On the question of internal stability, well, let's not again be hypocritical and have double standards. Latvia and Estonia both were permitted to join EU and NATO when both countries have huge Russian-speaking populations. Latvia has more Russian speakers than Ukraine. Riga is more of a Russian-speaking city than is Kiev. And worse, all of those, or the majority of those Russian speakers in Latvia and Estonia do not have citizenship. And therefore they are a potential element in destabilization of those two countries. Russian speakers in Ukraine, of course, everybody had citizenship since 1991 in a zero option. So if it was okay to bringing those countries into NATO and the EU, even though they had huge Russian-speaking populations, then why not in the case of Ukraine? Plus, we need to take into account that Ukraine has a far smaller anti-NATO lobby today than Montenegro, for example. Montenegrin nationalists are pro-Serb, anti-Western. Ukraine's nationalists on the far right are pro-NATO. They have reservations. Ukraine's far right has reservations about the EU because of things like same-sex marriage and things like that. But on NATO, all of Ukraine's far right supports membership. So that makes Ukraine different and better than Montenegro. But also what's changed, and NATO really has not taken this into account, is that since 2014, we can thank Vladimir Putin for making the party regions and other pro-Russian forces like the Communist Party pretty irrelevant. And therefore that pro-Russian, CIS, Eurasian Economic Union kind of lobby is now gone. It's very, very low in support. Support for NATO has gone up. Different opinion polls will give you different figures. Anything from 45 to 55% is the usual amount. And this is absolutely fine in a pre-referendum result. We have to remember that not every country that joined NATO even had a referendum. NATO is demanding Ukraine holds a referendum. Didn't demand Montenegro hold a referendum. They barely passed joining NATO in the Montenegrin parliament. They barely passed it by a small majority. It never had a referendum because probably would have lost. In Ukraine, a referendum, if it was held today, according to democratic initiatives, 75% of those taking part in the referendum would support NATO membership. So there's always a figure which is lower before the referendum and the referendum campaign begins, and then the higher figure during the campaign. One reason for that in the Ukrainian case is that those who support NATO membership are far more active, whereas the ones who are opposed today in Ukraine, very small number, 10-15%, are very passive. So in that sense, Ukraine looks very good. Many countries who did hold referendums to join NATO, like Slovenia and Hungary, barely got over 50%, something like maybe 51, I think, in one case, and certainly not more than 55 in the Hungarian case. So this was never a sweeping landslide in many countries. The two countries where it received overwhelming support were Poland and Romania, but not in many other countries. So in the case of Ukraine, a lot has changed on the ground since 2014, which works in favor of Ukraine's NATO potential membership. We can thank Putin for, in some ways, for taking away pro-Russian regions of Ukraine because they no longer would take part in the referendum. And, of course, Yanukovych's four-year kleptocracy and Putin's military aggression have delegitimized the pro-Russian component of Ukrainian foreign policy. And therefore, that aspect makes Ukraine look better. Ukraine also looks better even compared to Montenegro and many Baltic states in that you have a very strong process of integration and assimilation. Today, ethnic Russians in Ukraine only account for 6% of the population, down from over 20% in the 1989 Soviet census. So many Russians and people who previously described themselves as Russian Ukrainian are redefining themselves as Ukrainian. They could still be Russian speakers, but from a point of view of identity and citizenship, they identify with Ukraine. A lot of this, by the way, I was just in Ukraine, and I picked up this great book from Democratic Initiatives, which I'll send a link. You can find it online. So it has many articles looking at opinion polls since 2014 and how Ukrainian identity has changed in many different ways since 2014. What was until 2014 a minority viewpoint in Western Ukraine, sort of critical attitudes to Russia, is today a very broader viewpoint across the political spectrum. Today, 3/4 of Ukrainians have negative views of Vladimir Putin, the State Duma, and the Russian government. So this is no longer a viewpoint purely associated with West Ukraine. So all of that is analyzed in the book, and these are, very highly qualified sociologists who have looked at the changing landscape in Ukraine since 2014. Now, the other argument made often in the West is that, how can you have a country join NATO or the EU if you have part of your territory not controlled by your central government? And this, of course, is the reason why Putin creates frozen conflicts to try and prevent countries integrating into the West. So even agreeing to this viewpoint basically means you're helping Putin in his policies towards his neighbors in fabricating frozen conflicts. But nevertheless, why was it okay for Western Germany to join NATO and the EU when Eastern Germany was a frozen conflict for over 5 decades? It was a Soviet frozen conflict. That didn't stop West Germany joining NATO and the EU. And think of what that did to Western Germany. The modern democratic Germany of today is a product of it being allowed to join NATO and the EU. Similarly with Cyprus. Northern Cyprus has been occupied by Turkey since the mid-70s. but it's been allowed to join the EU. Nobody raised that as a question. So one has to be very careful about using these type of double standards. If anything, in view of the fact that Ukrainian leaders, President Kuchma, gave away the world's third largest nuclear weapon stockpile between 1994 and 1996, Ukraine has a moral right to request of the West that it support it in its security situation. It's a country under military aggression from the West, from Russia, and therefore it has that moral right to demand that the West stand up for itself, and that let's not forget reminding NATO that back in 2008 in Bucharest, that NATO issued a resolution saying that Ukraine and Georgia would one day join NATO. Or maybe after Russia's aggression in Ukraine, maybe that one day has finally arrived. Thank you.